Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Beth Keene. I'm the CEO of Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for our Building Bridges series, which brings together leaders from diverse communities for important conversations about working toward common social justice goals. This evening's discussion about working together to combat hate crimes comes in the wake of the tragedies and senseless murders this past weekend in Buffalo and Laguna Woods. We are horrified and heartbroken by these latest violent attacks that were fueled by hate. We condemn domestic terrorism, those supporting great replacement theory, and anyone who supports hate speech. Our work today is more critical than ever, given the fragile state of today's world, with the war in Ukraine, humanitarian and refugee crises, and the alarming rise in hate crimes, especially targeting Black, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Jewish, and other diverse communities. A study by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism revealed that anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 339% last year, compared to the year before. The report also found that Black Americans remained the most targeted group across most cities. The ADL's recent audit revealed a 34% increase in anti-Semitic incidents nationwide in 2021, averaging 7 anti-Semitic incidents each day. We must take action, and education is our greatest catalyst for change. Holocaust Museum LA's mission is grounded in teaching students and visitors the critical lessons of the Holocaust and its continued social relevance, empowering them to speak out and stand up against hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. In recognition of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month and Jewish American Heritage Month, we are pleased to welcome community leaders to discuss how our communities can foster stronger ties and join together to combat hate. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. My dear friend Wah Chen is co-founder of LAAUNCH, an acronym for Leading Asian Americans to Unite for Change. Their mission is to engage and empower Asian Americans to fight racism, increase representation, and share community resources. She and her identical twin sister Ming wrote a children's picture book called Escape, One Day We Had to Run, which tells true stories about ordinary people who are forced to leave their families and homes because of war, famine, intolerance, or political upheaval. Janie Fong is Senior Managing Director at East West Bank. We are very grateful to the East West Bank Foundation for their sponsorship of our newest exhibit, Hidden History, recounting the Shanghai Jewish story, that tells stories of immigrants looking for opportunity, refugees fleeing identity-based violence, and a community that work together to support one another. Joanna Mendelson is Senior Vice President of Community Engagement at the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. She previously worked for more than 2 decades with the ADL, supervising a team dedicated to tracking, exposing, and disrupting extremism and hate. And Joanna and I were just in Sacramento last week for JPAC's Advocacy Day, where we lobbied for a number of bills to combat hate and anti-Semitism. And Nancy Yap is Executive Director of the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, or CAUSE, a nonprofit organization committed to advancing the political and civic engagement of leaders in the Asian and Pacific Islander community. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. He also presents a monthly webinar called Dan Schnur Political Report for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. And as one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. Dan, thank you so much for helping us create our Building Bridges series and for serving as our moderator today.
Beth, thank you so much. And thanks so much to our panelists for joining us today. We're very, very excited to have the 4 of you with us. And I know we're going to be having a fascinating conversation, but also I don't want to neglect thanking our audience members who joined us for what I think will be a very important, and as Beth mentioned, a particularly timely discussion. It's been 2 years since we began the Building Bridges program. And over that time, we've worked together to explore topics of mutual interest and concern to both the Jewish community and many others of the most important voices in vital communities in California. We live in the most diverse neighborhood in the history of the planet Earth. And I give Beth and the rest of the museum leadership so much credit for bringing us together in this series to talk about topics of mutual concern and mutual opportunities. And that's exactly what we'll be doing today, as she mentioned, talking about the relationship and shared opportunities and challenges between the Asian and Pacific community, in Jewish and Asian Pacific communities. Now, there's a lot of commonalities and a lot of shared goals between our communities. And I'm going to ask my friend Joanna Mendelson, if I can, to help us start the conversation today. And Joe, I'm going to ask you a very broad question to get us going. Why should our let's assume that all communities should work together to combat hate and to foster, more mutually respectful relationships. But what is it about these two communities in particular that make it so important for us to work together to take on these challenges?
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much the Museum of the Holocaust for the opportunity to have the Jewish Federation here today on a very distinguished panel of leaders. To answer that question, first to begin, it's so unfortunate that every time we have opportunities like this to come together, we have a current event that underscores the necessity of that collaboration. And you just look in this last week with one local shooting and one shooting across the country that basically has ripple effects across our nation and impacts us all. So, at the kind of the big picture idea is that as someone who's tracked domestic terrorism for, decades upon decades, extremists like to target the other. And whether or not it's the Asian community, whether or not it's the Jewish community, whether or not it's any of the communities around our nation, whether or not LGBTQ or Sikh, Muslim, and so forth, it's the demonization of the other, the person that is on the outside, that is not one of them. And that notion, and we've seen that tie in throughout the white supremacist perpetrators that have carried out some horrific attacks in our country, that there is a thin line that connects each of that ideology, whether or not it's Christchurch or Poway or in El Paso or Howell or, Tree of Life Synagogue, Charlottesville. I mean, the list is sadly mounting and mounting. Add to that the fact that extremists never miss an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis. And we saw the conspiracies and disinformation employed by extremists targeting both the Asian community as well as the Jewish community. Asians were demonized like no other. The xenophobia that we saw mount in this country, targeting and blaming the entire AAPI community for what kind of a health crisis. And then the kind of fallout as a result where Asians were targeted, people even perceived to be Asian were targeted. In the same breath, Jews were targeted. They believed to be manipulating the virus, believed to be controlling, the kind of the globalists who are manipulating and controlling the world for a profit gain to create some type of depopulation project. And whether or not it was a call to weaponize the virus and target Asian communities, target Jewish communities, target your local minority. And so these conspiracies and disinformation, that in some ways the vitriol of the virtual space, all of this, and unfortunately, some of our leadership that has echoed some of the same tropes that we've found from the fringe in the mainstream spaces, all of these kind of pile on together to create an environment that calls for the demonization. And so it's so important that we find the commonality between our two communities, between the Asian community, between the Jewish community, and frankly, with all the communities, to create a more powerful force of the other, of pushing back against that narrative that has sought to demonize and create violence.
Joanna, thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to come back to you in just a couple of minutes to talk a little bit more about what can be done in the face of these kind of challenges. But I'm very eager now to bring Wah Chen into this conversation, because while not all of the museum's members and participants in our programs are Jewish, a large number are. And so Wah, I thought it'd be helpful for you to take a few minutes, if you will, and talk about some of the work that you and your organization have done in surveying the Asian Pacific community. Both one, I think will be helpful for us to have an understanding of how this community regards these challenges, but particularly for those of us from other backgrounds to understand in particular how the API community regards this situation as it's developed. Tell us a little bit about your survey, if you can.
Yes, thank you so much, Dan. And thank you, Joanna, too. I look forward to this conversation, Beth, and to the Holocaust Museum LA for having me. As Beth mentioned, a group of old friends, including my identical twin sister, Ming, and I started a nonprofit, and we're in the process, it's called LAAUNCH, and we're in the process of merging with the largest AAPI foundation in the country called the Asian American Foundation. That is, the acronym is TAF. And under the amazing and able leadership of the CEO of TAF, Norman Chen, and with key input from a very talented Norwegian data scientist, Dr. Jonas Tungodden, and a very experienced AAPI academic advisory board, we collaborated on our main project called the Status Index Report. And here I want to thank Janie Fong and Dominic Eng, and I'm going to share the screen right now for the Status Index Report. East West Bank was our earliest backer. This is the second consecutive year of the Status Index Report that was inspired by the Anti-Defamation League's annual survey. This report stands for the social tracking of Asian Americans in the US today. And basically, we surveyed more than 5,000 US citizens. It was conducted a few days over February, and it has a confidence level of 95%. We grouped the questions and findings into 4 main topics: race relations, belonging and acceptance, perceptions and stereotypes, visibility, and awareness. We had some interesting takeaways, and basically the overarching message is that there are deeper systemic issues that go beyond what people may think is obvious. So people may think COVID-19 or Trump were the leading causes for Asian Americans being impacted by racist and violent attacks. And so while that's true that it's an issue the community has been dealing with in silence for hundreds of years. So I'm just gonna quickly show you bits and bobs of our social media campaign that highlight some of the findings from the survey. 1 in 5 Americans believe race relations have improved. Then again, 1 in 5 Americans also believe that the earth is flat. More than 70% of Asian Americans in Hopeful Bend believe that anti-Asian American racism should be addressed. 43% of Asian Americans believe that Asian Americans are more loyal to their perceived country of origin. Here we see something that is often said about the Jewish people. Are they more loyal to Israel? Is a recurring question that comes up again and again in the ADL survey. 1 in 3 Americans are unaware that violence has significantly increased against Asian Americans in the past year. But we all probably know who's preparing to buy Twitter right now. And year over year, we also have seen that Americans still can't name a prominent Asian American. And when they do, it's often Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, both of whom are not even Asian Americans. So this is just a little tidbit of our status index report, which is downloadable actually from our website, www.launch2as.org or www.taaf.org. I'm trying to get back to not sharing my screen.
Well, thank you very, very much. Just the little bit of that survey data that you showed raises all sorts of questions. So we will come back to this a little bit later in the conversation in order to dig deeper. But before we do, while you're not the only person here who comes armed with really interesting public opinion research data, and Nancy Yap, who, as Beth mentioned, is the executive director of CAUSE, Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, who's joined us on a number of these programs in the past. Nancy, you and I've really felt, from my standpoint, the privilege of working together on the California community poll over the last few years. CAUSE teaming up with leading Latino and Black community organizations to explore questions relating to discrimination and race relations. I feel like WA's offered us such interesting insights, in particular into the APIA community. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit of the findings from our survey work that's going to help our audience, understand this to an even greater degree.
Sure. And I think the main difference for us is that we're really looking at a California statewide poll. And for us, what we found is that 3 in 4 Asian Pacific Americans are worried about being a victim of physical violence or hate crime. And there also is a high percentage of folks, 63%, concerned about being mocked or harassed, 60% worried that their children will be bullied and harassed at school for their race or ethnicity. And I think as we've known over these last few years in this space, we've had an opportunity to have conversations about the impact of anti-Asian hate on our communities and the fear that we're feeling. The poll that we've done did reflect that with almost 11,000 anti-Asian hate incidents from March 2020 to December 2021. I think the stories about, like from within our community, as well as people seeing it happening, whether it's through media or through anecdote, all of it happening in our communities and creating that sense of concern. Part of what we're seeing also in our poll, so we did our first poll in February 2020 before the pandemic began, and then have since done 4 polls throughout. And what we're finding is that all communities are becoming increasingly aware of the prejudice and discrimination that our communities experience as Asian and Pacific Islanders. That increased awareness, although it can be tied to that increase in anti-Asian hate incidents, is also related to finding that root cause where we can find solutions that really start to address how all of us not only are experiencing this, but also where we can start to prevent it from its roots. And so I think for us, what we're really finding in this data is there are some sort of down depressing moments. We did poll how everyone felt about their concerns of physical violence and hate crime, and Asian and Pacific Islanders actually tracked as the most worried, particularly because of all of this. And even in all that, and I think something we also want to talk about is that Asian Pacific Americans continue to believe that there is hope for us to be accepted and more easily easily accepted in America in the future for who we are and for our culture and background at 67%, which was also the highest of every group polled. So not only like through this time of anti-Asian hate and like a very high percentage of fear, we're also very hopeful for the future. And here at Cause, we believe that part of that is that people are getting engaged. They're understanding where they can be part of the narrative, where they can start to create that change, and that they can be part of making it so that we are more part of the solutions that prevent this from happening in the future.
And one other parallel between the communities that hopefully we can explore a little bit later, which is that continuing commitment and sense of optimism and determination, even in the face of these kind of challenges. And so Nancy will dig much deeper on this also, and we'll come back to you in order to go deeper in just a minute. But last but not least, I finally want to bring Janie Fong into this conversation, because Janie, I think you bring such an important voice to what we're talking about here today. Look, Cause and Launch and the Federation all do tremendous work, and it's these kind of community organizations that are vital to our progress. But one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past, which I think is so important for our audience to be reminded of, is the necessity of private sector leaders such as yourself taking on a role to move this discussion forward in all sorts of ways. And I'm wondering if you could spend a few minutes telling us about what you've learned from that perspective, about how best to work to overcome these challenges.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Beth, for having me. And actually, the credit really should go to Dominic Ng, our chairman and CEO of East West Bank. But I want to start by saying that our Asian and Jewish communities can certainly reflect on shared and common experiences with our long histories, our cultures, and challenges as immigrants to this country, and to honor our contributions to writing and building the American story. This is important as we look at solutions to combat the rise in hate crimes and to create more collective engagement, collaboration, coalition building, and to address bias and discrimination in this country. And I really like hearing about the polling work that TAF and of course, LAAUNCH and Cause are doing. So East West Bank has really been uniquely positioned in this dialogue, leading as a bank rooted in the Asian American community to meet the growing challenges of the AAPI community. Bridging diversity, cultures, ethnic, religious tolerance is rooted in our bank's identity and our mission statement and business model, and has been for decades as we approach our 50th year anniversary next year. We started as a savings and loan in 1973 right here in Los Angeles to support the underserved Asian community and their needs. Fast forward to history under the leadership of Dominic, some of you who know Dominic here on the panel, and now we're one of the top 25 banks in America and the largest independent bank headquartered in Southern California. And I reference these facts because of the significance of our origins and ethnic roots, and proudly as a Chinese American. And yet our growth and emergence in the mainstream community has helped us to serve as an important cultural bridge to other communities. Standing in unity and partnership with ethnic groups and organizations, including the important work of the Holocaust Museum, the LAAUNCH organization, Cause, Stop AAPI Hate, TAF, the APALF, and countless groups has been critical to address discrimination, diversity, and the advancement of Asians in civic and public office. We're also working in tandem with art and cultural museums, educational platforms to develop program awareness, research initiatives, data collection, federal legislation, advocating for the passage of the Bipartisan Hate Crimes Law, which was signed last year, to advance accountability at all levels, particularly with law enforcement measures and data collection at every level possible. We recognize there's massive underreporting in Asian American hate crimes and harassment, which must be monitored. We've learned how to overcome these challenges through collective engagement, bridge building, and years, decades of helping to advance the socioeconomic status of Asians in this country as the largest Asian American founded bank in the country. And as a financial institution, as you say, Dan, coming from the private sector, it's really critical that we continue to work closely to support and uplift our communities. But we do recognize that there's much more work to be done.
And there's so much more for us to talk about over the course of this conversation. So I want to dig deeper into what you've learned in your experience on this front, Janie. But before we dig deeper, I want to come back to Nancy, because I think she made a really important point about the type of cooperation that each of you has referred to. And Nancy, we talked about just briefly, and I'm hoping you could spend a little bit more time on, is how the poll results that you referenced, that joint survey work, really is only a jumping off point in the work that Cause and your organization and colleagues do with representatives from other communities. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, those cross-community efforts and the value that comes from them.
Sure. And I think for me, so much of the work being rooted in our partnership with Hispanics Organized for Political Equality and the Los Angeles Urban League, for me, and in partnership with the Los Angeles Times, is just that all of us together are not only crafting the questions, talking about the results together, but also sharing the impact that these conversations have on our communities. And I think that's actually also where the Holocaust Museum LA has really played a key factor in these building bridges conversations. So it's not just the data itself, but it's that we're constantly like talking about what questions we have for our communities, how is data changing from each time we poll the community? What are the incidents that are leading to influencing this data? But also, what are the conversations we need to have together to create that change? I continue to be so impressed with our partners in both this poll and their thoughtfulness, as well as with Holocaust Museum's thoughtfulness of including us. I think especially for us, last year, right after the shootings in Atlanta of a number of Asian American women, I think we were just hurting. And I felt like there were a lot of communities who could relate to that feeling, relate to what we were going through. And this space actually gave us an opportunity to talk about it all together. And that's so valuable a year later when we're still experiencing hate. For me also, as an Asian American woman, hearing the stories that happened in Dallas, the shootings in Dallas, where 3 women were also shot, and it was immediately stated to not be a hate crime, only to later discover that there were previous incidents. This is where we also feel like our stories aren't being heard. We're not believed. Us being afraid is not valuable. And I think turning to our communities to have these conversations together is part not only of the healing process, but also part of the strategies for change. And so as we know one another, as we learn through this collaboration, we're able to really show up for each other, show up when we need to, and have the difficult conversations when we need to have them.
And I think it's such an important point. It's not just developing these relationships so we can have more friends, but rather so we can take on these common challenges together that much more effectively. For those of you who've watched these conversations in the past, many of you may remember that one of my favorite quotations comes from Mark Twain. He liked to say, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." And Janie, I feel like you're exceptionally well positioned, not just professionally, but academically, to talk about the lessons we can learn from history, about how these challenges have been confronted in the past, and why these joint efforts are so important. Maybe you can take a bit of time and help our audience understand why this collective action is so helpful.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, history is extremely important, and it helps us to learn from past mistakes and to shape more effective public policy moving forward. But it also teaches younger generations, future generations, the importance of developing greater compassion towards our communities. Asians have had a long history in America and have played an essential role in writing the American story. From building our US transcontinental railroad with over 20,000 Chinese laborers working at wages far below their counterparts, to Asians serving our country in uniform, to working in jobs to support the growth of major industries in this country, to starting in businesses, winning Olympic gold medals, and to advocating for civil rights. One will find that when we turn to history, Asians faced a long history of discrimination in this country. The Chinese came to California in 1820 to escape poverty and turmoil, much like the Jewish American immigrant story. The Chinese were subject to one of the largest, if not the largest, single lynchings in the United States during the massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles. Then came the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, barring Chinese from coming to America and becoming citizens. Asians are often an easy scapegoat, as history tells us, with racist backlashes when there are periods of economic uncertainty in this country, economic vulnerabilities. And history also reveals that we're easy targets for xenophobic labels, from quote unquote, the yellow peril to quote unquote, the Chinese virus, often treating Asians as perpetual foreigners. Similarly, Jewish immigrants arrived to this country over 368 years ago with a long history of contribution to the American story. The Holocaust is a chapter in history which must also be told to educate current and future generations to help shape a world free from anti-Semitism and ignorance. We're delighted that we were funding, and we are funding, the Holocaust Museum special program to recognize the Jewish settlement in Shanghai and the story of European Jews finding hope and a home in Shanghai with open doors during a time of great desperation and survival. These are the stories which really must be remembered, highlighting how our communities have supported each other. The Jewish American story, the Holocaust Museum are important messaging platforms to all of us, Asian Americans included, to recognize the cultural strength, testimonies, and diverse social contributions made to the fabric of this country.
I'm so glad, Janie, that you mentioned the partnership that you have with the museum. My wife and I visited the settlement in Shanghai some years back when we were in that part of China, and to give a chance for people of Los Angeles, not just Jewish or Asian Pacific, but the entire community, to understand the history is just such a valuable gift. So thank you so much. There's about 1,000 things I wanted to ask you about the poll that you've done, but one thing in particular that you just touched on briefly that I'd like to dig deeper on is, I know that one of the main takeaways from the poll was this question of perceptions of the Asian Pacific community, and in particular, once again, some of the commonalities and shared challenges between the Asian Pacific and Jewish communities as it relates to these perceptions and stereotypes. And one in particular that I know we've all heard and we've all talked about that I'm hoping you'd be willing to address is the stereotype of the model minority myth. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that myth and what you found in your survey work regarding it.
Sure. So a little bit of background that the model minority was coined by a sociologist in the New York Times Magazine in the 1960s, branding Asian Americans as law-abiding and attaining higher educational and financial success relative to other racial groups. The mythic quality tends to dehumanize individuals. It flattens diversity that exists within the Asian American communities. It's an incredibly diverse community made up of more than 20 ethnic identities, and renders invisible Asian Americans in discussions of race and prejudice in America, often pitting us against other disadvantaged communities such as Black Americans and Hispanic and Latino Americans. It's a toxic oversimplification that contributes to why Asian Americans have been overlooked traditionally in research, clinical outreach, advocacy, and philanthropy. We've been so inspired by the Jewish community and the tradition of speaking up and speaking out following the consistent work of the Holocaust Museum and the Anti-Defamation League.
Well, thank you, Wah. And Joanna, if you'd be willing, I hope that this is a topic on which you'd be willing to weigh in also, because beyond even the points that Wah made, this creates certain obstacles for both communities and our efforts to move forward. How so?
So, Wah painted the larger picture and understanding of this model minority, right? And this, even the positive stereotypes of groups can be very detrimental. Because if you can imagine that a model minority that is described in terms of being smart or nice or hardworking, right? These things that make that community really stand out. What it also comes with is don't speak out, don't raise your head, don't rock the boat. Stay in your lane and don't kind of use your voice, don't argue, because that will bring attention. And both culturally, as well as part of the larger stereotypes upon this one community, creates a silencing effect. And I can say within the Jewish community, you know, as you've seen, we just look very closely, you know, at the stereotypes that have, you know, for ages upon ages, we're going back centuries. We can look back at the macro and micro conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic tropes of whether or not it's power or greed, and see it apply to today, whether or not we see people talk about the Rothschilds or the globalists that are manipulating and kind of operating the strings, the puppeteers. And I think that in itself is also very dangerous, right? So you have these stereotypes that are kind of these overarching beliefs of these various communities that then spills over into hate or into violence or into a further demonization of that community.
Well, Joe, I think you make several important points, but if I have one takeaway from 2 years of these Building Bridges programs, is that don't rock the vote, don't speak out is exactly the wrong way to deal with these kind of challenges. And the only thing better than speaking out and more effective than speaking out is doing it together. Speaking of speaking out, before I go back to Wah for my next question for her, I should remind the audience, I know it's been, we've had a bit of a hiatus since our last program, but just to remind you, we'd love to hear your questions too. And so if you have any questions you'd like me to put to the panelists on your behalf, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. We've got about 20 minutes left. And if you have questions you'd like me to ask any or all of the panelists, by all means, type them in. And I'll do my best to work in as many of them as I can between now and 6 o'clock. But Wah, I wonder if you could help me with something here. It occurs to me as we're listening to this conversation, we're talking, I think, in very important ways about overcoming challenges and obstacles and difficulties. And one of the things I've heard you talk about in the past, which I think is so important to remember, is that our work doesn't have to be solely based in pain, in past setbacks. We can be motivated in a much broader range of ways. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we should be thinking about how to move forward, given the challenges that you've outlined. What should be our next steps? What should we be thinking about?
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for bringing up a conversation that Dan and I had as a sidebar, was how do we, interviewing for pain, much like having parents ask kids, questions, isn't always helpful. And while we must acknowledge painful truths about our past histories in this country, the state of affairs is not all terrible. Our 2022 status index revealed some hopeful things, including, I was going to share really quickly the last slide. Some of the more positive things. Okay, well, it's okay. My apologies.
No worries at all.
Okay, well, it's not letting me share the positive things. However, the vast majority of Americans believe anti-Asian American racism should be addressed, and they want to see more Asian Americans in TV and the movies. I know Nancy Yap is involved with an incredible organization called Gold House that is really focused on helping raise Asian Americans in media. The respondents in this year see education of Asian Asian American history, culture, and experiences as leading solutions to address hate. We saw state legislatures vote in California, Illinois, New Jersey, and other states to have Asian American history as part of their curriculum. I think that's incredible. Asian Americans ourselves are awakened, traditionally non-activist Asian Americans like myself, my twin sister Ming, our friends David and Richard Ting, Ed King, Norman Chen, Eric Toda. The gift in this sort of tragedy unfolding is that we realize that we cannot be complacent. So I see that as incredibly positive.
Well, thank you, Wah. And Janie, if I can, I'm going to ask you the same question. We've looked back for wisdom and guidance on how to confront these challenges. What should we be thinking about going forward?
Well, looking forward, Dan, I think we should think about the Asian Pacific Islander community and the important role we play in writing the American story, not only in the past and present, but in the future. We're the fastest growing ethnic minority group in America. We have now over 22 million Asians in this country, Asian Americans, making up 7% of the population and tracing roots to more than 20 countries. The US Asian population is projected to grow to 46 million by the year 2060. And the AAPI community will continue to make important inroads to every walk of society. And I'm confident of that. However, I think there's a need to what I call apply cautious optimism. And I add that because of the cycles of economic vulnerabilities, economic uncertainties, and the often irrational linkages to things like the pandemic laying blame against Asian Americans as scapegoats. These can chart a dangerous path, as history has shown, with continued bias against Asians, unless the rhetoric stops and there's greater accountability to stem these surge in attacks and acts of harassment. But thanks to the work of public and private sector leaders and organizations, to the continued work of LAAUNCH and CAUSE, and of course to the support of the Jewish American community, I'm optimistic. And with continued legislative monitoring, with enforcement measures and accountability, with applicable educational awareness programs across multi-ethnic platforms, we may see progress and improved sentiment. And that's the hope. We've observed progress and unified efforts in all of our communities towards effective legislation. The enactment of the Bipartisan Hate Crimes Act signed last May, creating oversight at the Department of Justice, is certainly critical. And I think continued legislative monitoring is important. Of course, private sector support towards these initiatives are critical. East West Bank has committed funding to numerous AAPI organizations with initiatives and pledges to advancing our communities, and this work in data collection, and of course, more reporting mechanisms to help identify and prosecute hate crimes. I think ongoing education with our curriculum in schools to equip future generations is equally important. To educate students and future generations about the Asian American story, the Jewish American story, and other ethnic minorities that make the fabric of this country strong.
Okay. Thank you so much, Janie. Joanna, I'm gonna ask you the same question. We've talked about our past lessons and our challenges going forward, but what can you offer the rest of us in terms of our next steps, how we can keep moving forward to confront these challenges successfully?
So I, as someone who looked at really the darkest corners of our country, one may have kind of been taken down that rabbit hole of just loss, throw your hands up. And yet I actually hold some great optimism, for all the things that Janie just mentioned in terms of how we are moving as a society to think about ways of responding, whether or not it's the legislation that we're passing here in California, commissioned an anti-hate commission. There's bills, there's hate crime laws, there's movement forward within the tech companies to make our platforms more transparent. transparent. There's educational processes to recognize and celebrate diversity and culture. And then there's community groups and coalitions and conversations just like this one, where we are talking about these issues. We are working together. We are showing up in each one of these spaces. And if I could just, think about an imagery that really stuck with me, is that a rabbi got up and he took a white piece of paper and he drew a black dot, a big Sharpie black dot on the center of that paper. And he asked the audience, what do you see? And of course, everyone identified that black dot. But he said, really, the society is all the white that surrounds it. It's the response. That black dot are the incidents that befell our country recently. It's the Laguna Woods. It's the Buffalo, New York, right? Our attention is drawn there. But it's how we choose to respond and how we focus our narrative and our attention. And the hope that we can bring to this conversation, that doesn't define our country. These incidents don't define it. These numbers help us to understand, but and these stats help us to use policy to back up the data. But in actuality, our nation is much better than these low points of our society. So I am optimistic.
And Nancy, you began to raise this point of the importance of optimism when you were going through the survey results. And as I was listening to go through some of those poll numbers, and I was beginning to get a little bit discouraged. And then you reminded us that even in the face of all these challenges, how to the degree to which these communities are able to remain optimistic in the face of these challenges. Same question to you as for the rest of the panel. Knowing that this optimism is critical importance, talk a little bit more, if you can, about what else we should keep in mind as we move forward, and particularly the importance of moving forward together.
Sure. I mean, in a lot of ways, there's just a lot of friends to make and a lot of partners to grow, and I look at this call in the 5 of us and all of the circles where we overlap that even brought us to the space. East West Bank is also a supporter of our work, and I know LAAUNCH's overlap with our work is also very strong. And I look forward to all that we will do together, but also continue to do together with our partners here today. And so, the way we show up for each other matters. It's more than just what we say. And I think it is about what we do, but also what we do when we're not asked to do it. And so I think that some of that optimism does come from learning about each other, understanding each other's communities, and finding those commonalities that actually bring us to these places where we see that so many of the things that impact us impact each other. And so the more points we find where we have those commonalities, I think the easier the work can be, especially in the moments when it's really hard and really dark. A story that I share often related to building bridges in particular is when the Atlanta shootings happened last year. I actually had found out about it really late in the evening, and the person who I heard it from was actually one of the other panelists for an upcoming Building Bridges. Rabbi Joel Simmons actually emailed me just saying that he stood with us and that he was there with our community during these times. And it was meaningful to hear it from someone who I was both partnering with in this work, but also who genuinely meant it, from leader to leader, but also just individual to individual, from the partnership and the relationship we built. And so, yes, there are these broader community conversations that need to happen, but it's also important that we show up as individuals for one another as well. So I think it all goes together, and it's an important part of keeping that optimism of how change can be one small moment at a time.
Well, Nancy, I think first of all, it's such a touching story. And Joel Simmons and Jewish Center for Justice have been a frequent participant in these discussions, and I think the discussions have been richer because of them. But I think you made such an important point here. We've talked a lot today and in the past about communities working together. Well, a community can be a pretty big and sometimes amorphous thing. And I think what you've done, Nancy, which I think is particularly valuable, is reminding us that communities are comprised of individual people. And when we talk about communities working together, what we're really talking about is individuals reaching out to each other, sometimes collectively, sometimes organizationally, but much more in a much more vital way, to reach out personally. And, after a tragedy like Laguna Woods, to reach out to those who whose community has been particularly shattered by that horror. After Buffalo, after Pittsburgh, after Poway, after El Paso, very few of these horrific events are targeted at all of our communities, but they're going to become much, much less frequent if all our communities stand up against them, whether the individual atrocity happened to be targeted in our direction or in another's. I guess one last question for any of you who'd like to take a shot at it is, I will leave here, I know, in a few minutes, feeling very encouraged and very optimistic and very resolute about moving forward. But I know, sadly, in the not too distant future, there will be another Pittsburgh, there will be another Buffalo, there will be another Poway, there'll be another Laguna Woods, there'll be another El Paso. For anybody of you who would like to, can you tell those of us who've gathered here today how to stay optimistic the next time that happens?
I think for me, optimism in the face of violence is always going to be hard. And I think allowing ourselves to feel the hurt is important, and having someone to dig us out again is important too. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I want to know I did everything I could to help with the moment before and the moment after. We are currently doing a lot of work around voter engagement and voter turnout, because one of the ways you do that is speaking up, not just to vote, but to get engaged, be a part of the decision-making process, and be a part of the healing that our communities need. And I know there's a lot of ways to do it. And in this role, I've had a chance to explore so many of them. But it's important that we also advocate for people's voices to be heard. Right now, one of the things CAUSE is working on is there actually were no vote centers in Koreatown and Chinatown in Los Angeles. And we started to work together with the registrar's office to fix that. And so we're actually going to announce tomorrow that there are 3 new vote centers in those neighborhoods. And so for me, it's that now let's get people to use them. And I think that is part of the optimism, is the more people I see engaged, the more I know there's opportunities for change. And that's exciting for me and helps me in these times that are so difficult.
Well, and another wonderful reminder, Nancy, that because although all of our organizations are nonpartisan and don't take sides in these elections, the importance of being involved, regardless of how you choose to exercise your vote, is of critical importance. And it is the way ultimately to beat back these forces. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to thank Janie Fong. I want to thank Wah Chen. I want to thank Joanna Mendelson. I want to thank Nancy Yap. You've led us through such an important and such an encouraging and such a necessary and such a timely conversation. I can't tell you how grateful we are to all of you. I also want to thank the team at the museum that does just wonderful work, not only on these programs, but on countless other programs, both online and in person again at the museum itself. You had a chance to see Beth Keen earlier, but Samantha Butlian, Sam, you were just terrific today. Jordana Gessler, Marnie Dechter, just an incredible team at the museum that makes this kind of programming available to all of you. So thanks to our panelists, thanks to our team at the museum, and thanks most importantly to our audience members. We love these conversations with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next month as we continue our Building Bridges program. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you either at the museum or online again sometime very soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.